Nigel, by the way. I like Tony's introduction of knowing bugger all about the paid sector, because sometimes I wake up and think the same, really. But there we go. I think my kind of intention in this first 10 minutes is just to paint a few pictures, offer a few reflections on where I'm coming from. Mohammed is going to then present a different perspective from his point of view, and then Naomi's going to build a little bit on what I've said and go into the more detail. So if you're looking for where we're going, that's more or less what I think is the plan, really. I'm happy for us to stop during my bit if you want, but as Tony said, I'm just going to do 10 minutes or so under this kind of title. If you want to know where I'm coming from, I work for Frontier Youth Trust, which is a national youth work organisation, been going 50 years now. I've been there 15 years, which is, I was just chatting to Tony here. I kind of love it, really, and I sometimes think, what else could I do? But then I go, I love this, and so I kind of just keep on doing it. So despite my advancing years, I kind of enjoy it as a kind of vocation, if you like. I've also done work in churches in affluent Cheshire. I spent my early parts of years in the lovely area of Congleton, Macclesfield, Alderley Edge, Wimslow. I was a banker in my early career. So I can confirm all those stories of excesses and wrongdoings. And I've also worked for about a dozen years in the coalfields of North Nottinghamshire, almost the polar opposite of kind of Cheshire, with lots of kind of challenges and so forth. The bit I'm going to do here is inevitably a very personal reflection. I'm not pretending that what I say describes all the type of faith youth work I'm involved in, so it's just a few insights on where I'm coming from, which I hope is kind of okay. I think one of the things which is kind of problematic whenever we talk about this subject is what we mean by any sort of faith-type work. If you think it's complicated trying to describe youth work, generally it gets even more complicated when you introduce notions of faith, and most of my PhD waxed lyrically and pointlessly for page after page discussing the various definitions. Some of the people in this room were quoted and dissected and then put back together in a kind of thing. So these are some of the words I've come across to describe the type of work which I'm involved in: faith-based, designated, related, permeated, linked, sensitive. And if you want to read my PhD, you can. But I settled on Christian motivated work to describe what I'm involved. And I liked the idea that it was about my motivation and some of my colleagues, rather than what structure or content the work might actually take. Motivated for me talked about the driver and the reason why I do something, not necessarily the content. It also focused on a process and how that kind of outworked, and it clarified for me that sense of what organisationally we were about. Our motivation was based on our Christian faith, but that didn't necessarily mean we exclusively worked with anyone else who ascribed to that. We would work with anyone and so forth. It also is a phrase which allows dialogue, because for me it doesn't put anything else on anyone else. I'm motivated by this, but I'm not expecting necessarily anyone else to be, and I found that a helpful kind of starting point for me. And as Tony has done, and I know Naomi's going to build on this, it helpfully described those shared internal beliefs. I'm not going to say anything more about that because I know Naomi's going to unpack it further. It gets complicated though, because I would differentiate from what I call Christian motivated work to what others would call youth ministry. I used to do what I would call youth ministry, but I don't anymore. And that's mainly working, and again these are my definitions, it's church-based, it might involve things around worship, Bible study, tends to only work with Christian young people, and it tends to be involved evangelistically perhaps in its outlook. That's generally speaking not what I'm talking about today. We argue in our sector about the meanings of these words. I see Terry's smiling away there because I know it's his work about this dilemma. Is he a chaplain? Is he a youth worker? But those are generally the kind of terminology I'm talking about when I explore this today, which I hope is okay. It would be foolish to not acknowledge that there are some elephants in the room when it comes to faith and youth work. In fact, there's many elephants in the room. And in a stroke of genius, you'll be pleased to know I'm going to gloss over those and not talk about what's happened is, I hope it's alright to say his name, we've done a deal is that I'm good cop today and she's bad cop, which is very unusual for me because I'm normally bad cop and grumpy and cynical and so forth, whereas Naomi's going to unpack every single one of these challenges and say why it's like it is. No, she's not. She's going to touch on a couple of them. But I do want to acknowledge up front that faith-based youth work, particularly the Christian dynamic, often has got it wrong and continues to do so in many circles. But that's probably all I'm going to say that at this kind of juncture, if that's okay. So what are the manifestations getting into some detail around how this work operates? And I'm dipping into Frontier Youth Trust to illustrate this. We do traditional informal education youth work. We do a lot of open access work, detached-based youth work. We serve youth centres. We do work which churches do, perhaps in a community centre like this and the like. And as far as I'm concerned, it is more or less pure informal education work. Our streets-based network, which I'll talk about shortly, which some people in here are part of, we've got about 60 projects affiliated to that, working with around 8,000 young people every month. And that, as far as I know, is as close to that pureness of kind of informal education youth work as is possible to get. So I think it's alive and well. Various people make claims in the Christian sector that we are now the biggest sector and therefore the most powerful and you should do what we say. I kind of don't buy that kind of narrative. I'm not saying we're not the biggest, we may be, but who cares really? But it serves some people's agendas to say that. But I'll set that aside for now. We also do the work with young people type approach too. We do targeted work, programmed work. We offer specialist services with alternative education with young offenders. I hope and I believe it's still very young person centred. And whilst it might be targeted, particularly in the alternative education and young offender work we do, it is very much along the lines of the young people's agenda. And sometimes it goes really, really pear-shaped. But there you go. We also do what we would call missional type approaches. I think Frontier Youth Trust doesn't really do the evangelism bit, but we do mission in what I would say was a very broad understanding of that word. It was holistic, and our alternative education project uses this little soundbite here as its strapline. It brings home, hope and wholeness to the young people it's to work with. And that's something I'm very comfortable embracing. That doesn't mean we force a particular narrative on people, but it does underpin everything we do, as that's our explicit agenda. We also do the advocacy campaigning types things. We've recently been running a campaign on trust. I went to Amsterdam for a holiday and I saw in this youth centre window, do not trust young people under 30. At the time I didn't know it was a youth centre, and I went, what? What is that? And then I read the small print and I went, oh, it's a youth project. So I unashamedly stole it and made it under 25, and that's been really successful in engaging adults to try and get young people to be trusted, particularly in churches where they tend to be marginalised when it comes to leadership involvement of shaping things. So we kind of do those sorts of things. I think I've kind of been, and I know a few people very passionate about the Defensive Youth Work campaign, and we filtered that out across the sector, trying to build a sense of momentum. And some of you are aware we've recently been exploring the whole outcomes-led agenda and very critical of that and how we might move that forward. So I think there's a lot of kind of crossover there when it comes to those sorts of issues. In my PhD I introduced this idea of telos. It's a kind of a Greek word for those not familiar. It's that ultimate end that you're trying to get to. I built a house as a model for youth work, I won't bore you with that, but the roof was the telos. What is the ultimate purpose of what we're about? And in the sense that what I'm about, it is about that wholesale transformation, young people, community, society. So in that process, we help people flourish and build the common good, all of which I will say about later. But that is, if you're looking for what my ultimate end point is, it's not conversions or getting people to come to church. It's very much around those kind of agendas. But I would be naive to think that my good friend James and Helen, we'd all probably have very different perspectives on what is meant by Christian motivated work. So it's a vast mosaic and kaleidoscope of projects and enterprises. I would hazard a guess that if you could name something, there's probably someone in the Christian sector doing it when it comes to work with young people in as broad as possible. The biggest challenge, I think, for many of us is, and again I'm borrowing this phrase from someone at Goldsmiths University, is we can become subconsciously secular in what we do, and whilst our motivation might be faith orientated, we can kind of forget about it. And I'll give you an example. I don't know why, okay, so bear out on this, but one of the Street Space Project has been working with an organisation to develop a theory of change. I don't actually know how we existed without theory of changes until someone invented them, but hey, let's just live with that for a moment and set that aside as my personal, why are you doing this? But anyway, the organisation they were working with came up with this phrase, which I'm not going to read out because it's not the detail that's important. And it has to say, I think it genuinely reflects, James is part of the Street Space thing, I think it genuinely reflects what Street Space is about. And I was quite excited reading it, but when I read it the second time, this question came to me. Is it basically completely removed God from the narrative? And being as we're an organisation which is motivated by our faith in God, that kind of seems a little abstract. And I think that's one of the tensions when it comes to work, to networking with others, to funding, is to where the place of faith sits in that whole kind of thing is a real challenge. I used to work for a funder in Nottinghamshire, and Christians and Muslims did the same thing. They talked about spiritual development and cultural diversity, and they really mean promoting their own faith. And I think we haven't solved that, I don't think, as to how we negotiate that. So, for me, it's about trying to reflect and embodying Jesus, not building an institution of the church. It's about helping people thrive and flourish, not be moralistic or force them into being compliant. There is a sense for me it's very much about, to steal one of Jesus' phrase, good news for the poor, not about pomp or collusion with the state or any of those things. And to borrow another biblical kind of scriptural idea from the Jewish tradition, it's about shalom and trying to make things as best they possibly can be, dare I say, perhaps as they might have been intended to be, rather than anything else. So my question is, in your experiences, what are the challenges and opportunities that faith-motivated work presents and affords to you in your context? If you need some clues, I've put a little subtext there which you're happy to kind of delve into. So we've got about 9 minutes, 10 minutes in groups to just kind of unpack this, tell your stories of your experiences of perhaps connecting with faith-motivated work, church work, whatever it is, and what are the challenges and opportunities which emerge from that. And then we'll take 10 minutes feedback if that's okay. Is that all right? Okay. Thank you.
A few minutes now if people want to feed anything into the larger group, any insights or thoughts from your groups. We have only got a limited time, but perhaps a few comments. And if anyone's got questions for Nigel, he's obviously willing to answer as well.
Nigel, I just found myself thinking about dialogue. Well, I suppose it's not just for Nigel, but it's where are the spaces, and I think working in a university you get a lot of opportunity to come to see where dialogue can happen. Yeah, so it's, I suppose that's where things get changed and where new imaginations come into being. So I don't like the idea of there being these sectors that will actually, although I know there's a reality on the ground about that. Sorry, it wasn't really a question.
No, it's good. didn't have to be a question. Any thoughts? It's lovely.
Yeah. Following on the theme of dialogue and Janet, we started with trying to define faith, something that is believed in, that can be proven. We then talked about what is commonly recognised as an automatic association with that and religion and spirituality, which was not shared by everybody in the group. But then interestingly we talked about the fear of giving a personal perspective, which we then, some of us contested, that actually there are plenty of people who do want to say, this is what I believe. So whether or not, you know, it's clear that some people do fear that, some people don't fear that. So that's an interesting question. But ultimately, and this is the link with the idea around dialogue, is that if that fear exists to say what you believe in, then that's going to degrade dialogue.
Yeah, really quickly, I mean, I think it was 2007 I wrote something for the National Youth Agency on spirituality. It wasn't faith-based, it was generic spirituality. And the real thing emerging from that whole process was youth workers were afraid of that word, so they didn't do that work with young people. And it became this cyclical process. If a young person said, what do you think about it? The worker didn't know what to do with it, and so it was kind of set to one side. And so that resource was an attempt to provide a framework, if you like, and resources to address that. But I think it is, like you say, it's a tricky one.
Yeah, just on faith, I think that's the perception of faith often that it's believing in something which can't be proved, but I'm not convinced that that is fully what people from a faith perspective are saying. It's more about being convinced something is true and then putting your trust in that. So it's not necessarily blindly believing something which can't be proven. It's perhaps being convinced of something and then following that. So I think there's a bit more to kind of get out of that in some way.
You're interested to tell you about the nature of truth and that.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, that's crucial, isn't it?
Yeah. It depends who you're employed by. Because I'm a Christian and I've always worked in local authorities, so I can't always say stuff. I have to be quite careful. I always have to be quite careful. If young people want to discuss stuff, then I will talk about it. But I've not, knowing that it can be quite easy for people to make a complaint, you have to be quite careful as to how your work is seen by people, which sounds awful to say, but you do have to be quite careful. So I would hope that my youth work is more values driven, if you like.
Can I follow it up? Because one of the things that took me by surprise, and you need to speak for yourself, which is my understanding of it, was a worker working for a local authority saying that he felt less free to express those personal views than he had in work for the church. My question was, is that in our heads, or is that actually reality which carries sanctions with it? And you're saying it does.
Well, I think it's just more being aware that other people might take, I don't know if it's other people's views, but I suppose when I was working for my last local authority, certainly that last year I was there, I couldn't put a foot right at the time because they were trying to get rid of the youth workers. So we were having to be very careful about what we said and what we did. So, I mean, they still managed to push us, a few of us out anyway. But, there's that kind of, you don't want to, you're kind of walking a tightrope, if you like, because if somebody decides to take a dim view of what you've said, you can end up, with all sorts of problems.
I think it's changing. I think 15 years ago when I was in Kirkby in North Notts, it was war with the local authority. They didn't like us, we tried to work with them, but it wasn't happening. But I think, and again I quote this guy, Jürgen Habermas is one of the philosophers of our time. He was adamant faith had no place in society, and he's now changed his mind. And he's used this phrase, something missing. And I think politically and policy-wise, there was a growing acceptance, and I know sometimes it's from selfish motivations by the policymakers that actually perhaps there is something missing and perhaps there is time for dialogue and a better way of handling these things than drawing dividing lines. So I think it's a work in progress would be what I would observe.
One more quick comment. Sorry. One more. Is it Ruth? Yeah?
I was just thinking that I worked for a local authority for, it was 8 years, and I got redeployed to the YMCA. and I had always put CV on my hospital things and everything, and it was only through the YMCA that I realised I was an atheist. Because we've never talked about it, never explored it, never, and it was it's something I will always value incredibly, that we found ways of talking where I realised there was a huge gulf there that we'd never ever cross, but we had so much in common, and because it was about the first time we'd actually talked about the purpose of our work.
Yeah.
I just wanted to.
Okay.
I thought you were
going to say I put YMCA on it. I mean, I've worked with the YMCA for 20 years, got some great friends, and they sum up this whole debate, because they have some YMCAs at churches, in effect, doing alpha courses, trying to convert young people, and there's other YMCAs who I think have tried to get the word Christian out of their title and been, challenged appropriately. So there's the YMCA almost encapsulates this whole raft of possibilities. Okay, I mean this last section is perhaps building on some of the things Janet and Graham have said about dialogue really, and trying to find a way which perhaps we might be able to move to a sense that there's a sense of mirroring and reflecting, that there's more commonality that we might think. And I am going to draw a bit on my PhD here, hopefully it won't be academic, but part of my rationale in my PhD was to find a language and some concepts, to use that academic word, which would allow us to come together really. I mean, John Ellis, who's one of my heroes from the Shalom Project in Grimsby, I mean, he argues Jesus was the original informal educator, quite convincingly on the InFed website if you want to check it, so there's a starting point there. I think, again, to try and bring down these barriers, the young people we seek to serve are often the same, irrespective of where we might be coming from. I always try and see them through this lens of unconditional positive regard. I don't see them as problems to be solved, as deficits to be made up, and outcomes to be imposed upon them. And again, I think there's a great commonality there that we can work through. I also think there's a bit missing from some aspects of youth work, is we don't always challenge the social conditions which perhaps lead to some of the challenges young people face. And I think that, again, we could find some great possibilities of doing that, which is why I love the In Defence of Youth work, because it's one of the few groupings that actually seeks to challenge politically and policy-wise those kind of things, really. I think we both have a praxis too, that we look at our practice, have a research base and a sense of the academic all trying to work together. We might add theology instead of the academia, but nonetheless I think there is commonality there which we can pool together to come to this new place. I think one of my passions of late, and again Janet touched on it, is we're really good at tinkering and trying to adjust, but I somehow think we have to reach into the future, and the academics call it a radical imagination. We have to grab hold of what might be and try and bring it into the present rather than try and adjust what is. So, and again, to quote a guy, John Rawls, there is a great overlapping consensus, I think, between all people who work with young people, which we would seek to perhaps embrace more than we do. I talked about this earlier and it came in our group, that the two drivers to my PhD were the human flourishing dynamic and the common good. And I think, to me, this is one of the keys, that if we can find this common language around helping humans flourish, that would be positive. For me, it's obviously about faith and people being made in the image of God, but it might just be a baseline view of humanity as being important, and that's, I think, again, a possibility of commonality. Just to assure people, and again, we can't draw general conclusions, I put here accusations that faith conspires against human flourishing, cohesion and capital, and adds to them are plentiful. I have to say, in my PhD studies, that was not borne out. I didn't come across anything which was fed back about a negative view. The only negative comment in all my case studies was about someone's management style of working too hard. And that, I was looking for trouble, so I just have to take that at face value, that that wasn't present really. But my findings were about the commonality being around these things, which I won't read out just to save time, but again, hopefully there's some language issues there which we can pool as a kind of a togetherness. So the common good, simple definition To start with, equally to everyone's advantage. I asked a question, I did something on Wednesday, Thursday in Windsor with a group. You know, what would happen if every decision we made was taken in the interest of the common good? So it wasn't to my advantage, but perhaps have an eye and being equally to everyone. So, to me, again, we can perhaps find some hope if the work we undertake is mutually beneficial for everyone involved. It does have to have, for me, again, some solidarity with the marginalised, whatever that means. But that was a key thing in my PhD. It's about being local and grassroots, which I think when we had it in our group about there aren't sectors, I think that's one of the problems of the faith sector, is it is very local and grassroots. And unfortunately, as it pointed out, that if you look on Google and things, you tend to get the big organisations which tend to be from a particular viewpoint, not that grassroots viewpoint. So maybe there's some things there. I think we're all into bringing life to wherever we are. Telling the story. Interesting that storification was a word which appeared often in my findings in my PhD, and it's very at the heart of what In Defence is about. So I think there's a sense that it needs to be just, equitable and sustainable. And again, maybe the narrative there we can kind of put together on. I've done a book. It's been out 2 weeks now. It is in Christian settings. I often say it's God's will that you buy a copy, but perhaps not
a winner, that
we are asking £10 for it, and I can invoice you if you've not got money. But one of the things I wanted to do was not make any money out of it in order to reflect some of the narrative I believe in. So we've got this kind of thing going that you can actually pay what you want for it. We suggested a minimum of £3 if you're short of cash, and someone did that yesterday. But my mum holds the record at 50 quid so far. You're very welcome to beat that. But there's a sense that, you know, that's a deliberate statement to kind of the capitalist neoliberal kind of world, that hopefully we can get people who have got resource to support those who haven't. So talk to me afterwards if you want some, I've got some here. So the question to lead us into our final discussion from my point of view is, to what extent are the ideals of human flourishing and the common good principles around which we can work together for the benefit of young people? And if you need to know more about the common good, I particularly like this definition from Julia Unwin from the Joseph Rountree Foundation, which again you can read at your leisure if you want a little bit more understanding about that. So that's the question, and we'll come back shortly, if that's okay.
Same as before, any reflections or thoughts that you have from discussions? And feel free to continue the discussion from earlier if that's what you want to do. Different voices.
I think something that kind of threaded through our discussion was around picking up the thing you said about fear degrading dialogue, which I think is really significant in this. But the kind of counter movement is something around working in ways which actually enable and encourage people to think about purpose and to think about the meaning of what's being done, and that's that needn't be owned by any one faith or any other ideological position, but is then that space in which we can engage confidently as ourselves, and if we can do that, then that fear is pushed back, and actually that purposeful action becomes something all the more significant for us to gather around.
Yeah, and I think there's another thing about this. Why should you apologise about it? If somebody's got a view about your youth work, that's their view. And if they want to attack you and say, well, it's wrong, well, that's up to them. And I think the other thing is, I think where the youth faith-based work, we've got to stop being frightened of the secular society and show in a way that we can work in there. We can work with young people in the secular society. And there's a friend of mine who's a nun in London, and she lives in a multi-storey working with asylum seekers, people are kicked out and everything. And one of the things is that the common good to us, two kinds of theology. The street theology, which is about starting at the level with young people and working with them, not about telling them what their baggage is and everything else, but starting a journey with them. And I think that comes from the gospel theology of good news, and in a sense about the common good, about what we are. But why do we all, I'm sorry, I'm very much swear, but why do we also apologise? We seem to get into these kind of situations and people apologise about the fair. I did trade union work for 30 years and I was a convener of a union, and to be honest with you, I got attacked left, right and centre. But was I worried? No. Because the thing is, if you worry about it, they'll never move on. And I think it's that fear. There's a fear, and also there's a fear of change. And I've had to change and move on.
I got an email from someone this morning on the back of what I did earlier in the week, and they said I was very brave. And I went, really?
Yeah.
Where's that come from? And did they know what I was doing today? Because they've never said that.
There is a question about space. Now, I've always identified this as a peculiarly different kind of space, because it's my experience that these spaces are rarely present within the daily professional practice of many. I mean, they exist in some places, but what we see, I figure, is the kind of traditional space of reflection being filled with just more work. You know, I've been reading the theories of intensification. Just fill up the spaces, people won't complain. That's an interesting way of understanding it. But space becomes important if you want to reflect.
Can I push you towards the boundaries, Nigel? Would not people of deep faith and conviction take the view that human flourishing requires you in the end to be, e.g., a Christian, e.g., a practicing Jew, e.g., a practicing Muslim, and how then can they possibly hold a space for doubt, uncertainty, enabling other people to flourish if they don't reach that conclusion for themselves?
Yeah, I mean, Thomas Aquinas, who gave this momentum from a Catholic perspective and perhaps put the common good on the map, he would argue it's only to be found in God. The response I kind of gave is what we said in here. I'm not pretending these are not problematic ideals, but I consistently said love, freedom, security and justice are equally problematic. But that doesn't stop me having a quest for those things. You know? And I do get what you say, and I might even, you know, as a person of faith, end up in that place, but I wouldn't want to put it as a precondition that you have to sign up to this. So I think Tony and I have a big overlapping consensus around some of these things, and it's a bigger overlapping consensus than I would have with perhaps the more evangelical arm of the church. And so I'm more content to work with the best that can be within the framework we've got, rather than set up preconditions. But I do hear what you're saying, and I'm not saying I wouldn't ultimately end up in that place.
We were talking about, we started off talking about the starting point being important, but then we sort of moved on to say it's all right to start where young people are at on the street, but actually if you've got an agenda going on from your point, that actually the place where you have to finish is in the arms of Jesus or whatever else, then that obviously
that in a job.
Yeah, or yeah. So whatever that agenda is, if you have a fixed agenda, a fixed endpoint that you want to travel with that young person where you start where they're at, then and I was remembering about what Mark Smith wrote about the art of conversation on Infed, where he says that conversation, if you've got an agenda, it's not a dialogue, it ceases to be a dialogue. And I think something there about the starting is easy, but actually where's the end point? And if you've got an end point, then is it something different?
And I don't accept that. All I can say in front of you, Trist, is we get battered from both sides. We get accused of having the end point, which is what you described, but we get battered by the church for not having an end point. In that we've so become journey orientated and non-prescriptive that we get flack from the church for being non-prescriptive in joy. So there's a sense that I hear what you say. All I say is I can't win in that debate, and I'm not trying to win.
The Frontier Youth Trust says that it exists in order that young people can feel and experience God as well as hear Him.
Yeah.
It says that it exists so that they can make a contribution to developing the kingdom of God.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, surely this is about authenticity and honesty. I mean, and when we're talking about saying what we believe and having some commitment to it, then, you know, can we have it always? I don't know. I mean,
Well,
maybe we just have to accept.
we're getting to theology now. You see, I think someone without faith can make a contribution to the kingdom of God.
Yeah. Sorry, yeah.
So the state funded youth work says that young people need to make a contribution to
Economic well-being.
economic well-being. It's just, there's a gender, isn't there, in every form.
Yes.
There's something that I was just thinking of. I was doing a project with black churches in Sheffield about working with young people and prisoners and ex-prisoners. And I was sitting there feeling quite uncomfortable at one level because they were very, very strong, very, very strong churches. And I said to one of the leaders, I said, look, one of my favourite wayside pulpits was, when you're at sea in a storm, pray but keep on rowing. And I said, I'm a good rower. And he said, well, that's all right, because I'm a good prayer. And you know, I think that's really important, that some of us are rowers, not prayers, you know. And if we can work together on it, then I'm happy. But I do get a bit worried when we all have to stop rowing and start praying.
Possibly got time for one more? Yeah.
If it's all right, I'd like to go back a bit, because it seems to me the dialogue between Tom and Nigel there gets to the heart of it, whether it's about faith or not. It's about who are you prepared to work with and who are you prepared to compromise in order to ultimately get to where you think you need to get to. It seems to me those kind of, I'm not saying they're not important, so it's not meant to be offensive, but we're not in a situation where even what I believe about the world or what I wish about it or what any of us in here is on the cusp of happening. So to actually fall out with each other about something that isn't on the cusp of happening is interesting, but that's not meant to be patronising. It's just meant to be, you know, we do have a difficulty sometimes where we have these kind of conversations about anything, where we push each other into the ultimate rather than the kind of what is it we hold in common, how do we find ways of bringing that out with each other and allowing each other to disagree. Because it seems to me where we're up to, particularly working with young people in the communities, is how do we hold enough of ourselves forward and backward in order to actually have half a chance of having a conversation with someone that might allow them to become who they want to become. And that's not because I want to be miserabilist, it's because it seems to me that's the exciting thing about what we do. We're looking in other people's eyes to say, it's rubbish here, and they just look at me, kiss their teeth and go, woo. But a couple of weeks later, you have another conversation.
I agree.
No,
it happens all the time. It happens, you know, I don't believe in women bishops. I don't believe in gay bishops. Why? Because I don't believe in bishops. You know? I don't believe in ordained ministry, even though I'm part of a system that, you know, upholds it. So to me, to get polarised in that debate is nonsense, because
it's
I'm
also,
like the whole system.
and also, if you held on to your ultimate agenda of agendas, you wouldn't be doing this.
Yeah. Well, no, I'm trying to convert him. Tony said he was willing to be converted. No, he didn't. I made that up.
Do you want to sum up in any way?
Yeah. I mean, just to say, you know, debates, thank you for entertaining a personal indulgence from me, from my personal perspective. You know, all these things are works in progress. I apologise if as a representative of faith, we have in a way screwed up your life. It's not our intention to do that, but sometimes it happens. Some of my more zealous colleagues. It is very much what I presented is my perspective. Mohammed's going to bring his perspective, and then Naomi's going to bring hers, building on some of the things which I've done and framed. So hopefully we'll get a chance to go a bit deeper as today. So thank you very much.
Thanks all.